Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're embarking on a detailed analysis of DLSS 2 and FSR 2 technology to definitively answer the question of not only which upscaler is better, but by how much. In a lot of our recent GPU coverage, we've said briefly that Nvidia has the superior upscaling technique in DLSS without really elaborating on the situations where this is true. In how many games is DLSS better? Are there specific resolutions or quality settings where FSR is able to tie or outperform DLSS? When DLSS wins, is the difference noticeable enough? All of that will be answered today as we compare DLSS and FSR visual quality across 26 games, 2 resolutions, and 2 quality settings for a grand total of 104 configurations compared. Now, showing 104 different configurations in a single video is a bit ridiculous and would probably take several hours. My draft with all the comparisons in it is about 4 hours long. No one is going to watch that. It's a stupid amount of data and the video would end up super boring. Instead, I'll be focusing on the 9 most relevant examples that we'll look at in detail before summarizing the results for the full 26 games. If you really want to see samples from all 26 games, I'll be making an exclusive multi-hour video available to our Hardware Unboxed Patreon and Floatplane supporters. Up for testing today are 4K and 1440p target resolutions using both the quality and performance modes of DLSS 2 and FSR 2. I chose these configurations as I think they're the most relevant use cases for upscaling, and including any other examples like 1080p or bounce mode testing would have made this video drastically longer to make and include an unreasonable amount of work. It's only so many hours in the day, and I think the hundreds of comparison shots I took for this video is probably enough. DLSS 2 and FSR 2 tested using the quality and performance modes are directly comparable for 3 reasons. 1, they are both attempting to achieve the same goal, which is higher performance from upscaling a lower render resolution up to your display's native resolution. 2, both used the same scale factor at the same quality mode, 1.5 times using quality and 2.0 times using performance. At 4K, this would mean a 1440p render resolution using quality and 1080p using performance. And 3, both do deliver roughly the same performance using the same quality modes as was shown in Steve's latest video. So performance is not the focus of this video, we're more interested in the resulting image quality that a given mode produces. All games were tested using their most up-to-date version as of when this video was made, so we're looking at brand new, fresh comparisons. However, we are using the version of DLSS and FSR included with the given game. No DLSS DLL file replacement, no modding games to introduce DLSS or FSR support where there is none, just the existing native use of upscaling in these games. DLL file swaps and mods are popular in the enthusiast community to take upscaling to the next level or bring in new features, but this video is about both the image quality and implementation. Also factoring in those things would again make this video super long and complicated, so it's something we may cover in future content. We're also only covering DLSS versus FSR in this video. We'll be looking at native image quality in a separate video soon. All captures were taken on my AMD Ryzen 9 7950X test system with an Nvidia GeForce RTX 4080 graphics card, 32GB of DDR5 6000CL30 memory, an MSI MPG X670E carbon Wi-Fi motherboard, and it's all built inside the Corsair 5000D. All games were tested using the highest visual quality settings unless otherwise noted, with motion blur, chromatic aberration, film grain, and vignetting disabled where appropriate. Ray tracing was enabled for some games that could deliver over 60fps natively at 4K. We've also equalized sharpening settings between DLSS and FSR in all games where possible to deliver similar levels of sharpness. This may not mean the same sharpness setting number in the game, but the same resulting sharpness, or at least as close as we could get it. So let's get into the testing. First up, we have a recent release, and quite a controversial release at that, The Last of Us Part 1. Luckily, we aren't looking at performance, just the implementation of upscaling. Despite being widely destroyed for its poor quality port, this title actually has the most recent DLSS and FSR implementations of any game we found for testing. FSR 2.2 is included along with DLSS 2 version 3.1.2. Not to be confused with DLSS 3, which this game doesn't support. I'm talking about DLSS 2 Super Resolutions version 3.1.2. At 4K quality, both DLSS and FSR hold up pretty well. In this foliage-heavy scene, both upscalers provide a largely stable presentation with little shimmering, although if you look closely at the finest details, DLSS is more stable than FSR. The FSR image in areas such as Joel's hair and a few of the distant trees can shimmer a bit more than DLSS, but typically this is hard to notice. In this scene, both DLSS and FSR struggle to reconstruct the metal fence occluded by Joel's moving head with noticeably ugly artifacts, though these artifacts are worse in the FSR image and otherwise both are similar. And in this dark environment with airborne spores, the FSR image had a bit more ghosting on the fine particle elements, but only occasionally. It wasn't something I saw all the time in motion. DLSS looks better, it too has some particle ghosting, it's just less noticeable. Generally speaking, for 4K quality gamers, the DLSS presentation is slightly better and has fewer artifacts, though certainly FSR is very usable here. When we drop down to the performance mode at 4K, it's less favourable to FSR. The ugly artifacts from the fence we saw earlier are even more visible now and look quite bad, and while DLSS isn't very good here either, FSR has fallen away relative to DLSS. Similarly, in the forest area, both techniques are less stable than using the quality mode, but the shimmering in FSR is more noticeable. Both upscalers look similar in the dark scene with particles. DLSS is moderately better in these conditions, and it's harder to recommend FSR. At 1440p using the quality mode, DLSS is also moderately better. All of the issues we talked about in the 4K performance mode are present using 1440p quality, such as shimmering foliage and the issues with occluded elements. I actually think FSR looks worse here than using the 4K performance mode, which I guess makes sense as the render resolution using 1440p quality is lower than using 4K performance. Gamers that aren't very sensitive to artifacts will be okay with how FSR2 looks at this resolution, but DLSS is the preferred technique. At 1440p using the performance mode, DLSS is significantly better. It's really not a contest here. FSR looks pretty bad upscaling from such a low render resolution, with most elements on the screen shimmering or otherwise showing image instability. Even in the particle test, which previously fared okay, just looks terrible with FSR performance. I'd say DLSS looks bad in this configuration, but it's much more usable than FSR for those that need the biggest performance uplift at 1440p. Next game is Forspoken, and while very few people care about or play this game, it's a great example of how things can go wrong for FSR. Even at 4K using the quality mode for both DLSS 2.4.12 and FSR 2.1, it's immediately apparent just from the built-in benchmark that FSR sucks in this game. The level of flickering and shimmering, which can also be seen in-game when standing still, is terrible in the FSR image, and while DLSS does have the occasional bit of image instability, in general it's significantly clearer. Things only get worse in Forspoken looking at the 4K performance mode. Lowering the render resolution causes more instability in the FSR image across numerous areas such as foliage, buildings, and grates. Given that upscaling typically replaces anti-aliasing, it's unacceptable to have this level of shimmering when upscaling is used. It's basically like no anti-aliasing is being done at all. At 1440p, the results are embarrassing for FSR, which looks terrible next to DLSS even using the quality mode. When we switch over to the performance mode, FSR looks absolutely abysmal, which is really disappointing given Forspoken was supposed to be one of AMD's major sponsored titles. This is a real outlier for FSR versus DLSS, which points more towards an implementation issue than technology issue, but nevertheless AMD probably should have worked more closely on how FSR was implemented given their ties to this game. Dead Space is a very different experience to Forspoken. In this title, both DLSS 2.5.0 and FSR 2.1 upscaling are pretty bad to be honest. Here we're looking at the 4K quality mode, and one of the most obvious issues with DLSS in this game is ghosting. This is just one example, but it's pretty prevalent throughout the game. You'll see the edge of the elevator repeating and ghosting as it moves on the DLSS side, whereas for FSR that particular issue is not really seen, at least not to the same degree. I've heard claims of ghosting being fixed whenever any new DLSS revision comes out, whether that's version 2.3, 2.4, or even this 2.5, but at least based on Dead Space with DLSS 2.5, that absolutely isn't the case in some titles. While ghosting is an issue with DLSS, image stability and shimmering is an issue with FSR, something that's come up multiple times now. In this scene, just walking back and forth, the fine texture elements on the ground shimmer with FSR, whereas DLSS is more stable. And this is still with the maximum 4K quality mode. Given that both upscalers have fundamental issues with a similar degree of visibility in the game, I'd call this configuration a tie. At 4K using the performance mode, I came to similar conclusions. On the DLSS side, ghosting gets worse. On the FSR side, image stability is still a prevalent issue. The 1440p quality mode is interesting in this game though. DLSS ghosting isn't nearly as much of an issue at this resolution, which is a surprise. Ghosting is still visible to a small degree and more so than the FSR image, but generally it's harder to notice. Meanwhile, shimmering is still an issue with FSR to a greater degree than DLSS, which has a small dose of it too. At 1440p, FSR's issues with transparency is also reasonably noticeable. Things like interactive screens around the game world, indicators above doors, the in-game UI, they're all clearer on the DLSS side. With FSR having a small win for ghosting, I think at 1440p quality, DLSS ends up only slightly better in general, but if at all possible, I'd recommend native rendering. At 1440p performance, this is where FSR really struggles in dead space. DLSS still has its ghosting problem, and it's worse here than using the quality mode, but all the aforementioned issues with FSR are amplified. In particular, transparencies are horrible. Just look at the text above the door in this scene. Neither upscaler does a fantastic job, but FSR really butchers it badly. The faster and more intense the game is, the harder it is to spot artifacts and issues with upscaling. This is certainly the case with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which was recently updated to include FSR 2.1 to go along with DLSS 2.4.12. At 4K using the quality mode, I found it pretty hard to distinguish the difference in general gameplay, which we're illustrating here using the built-in benchmark as it's the easiest way to capture the same footage to compare side by side. My biggest criticism here is once again a few bits of image instability, sizzling, flickering with the FSR image that aren't present with DLSS. For example, this fine grate and mesh element seen for a brief moment has a few issues when rendered using FSR 2.1, especially as it's at an oblique angle, something that FSR struggles with. But generally, you have to nitpick to spot these problems. DLSS ends up slightly better, but I think either technique looks pretty good. Image stability tends to get worse when using the 4K performance mode. Distant fine details like wires, foliage, and mesh suffers on both DLSS and FSR. However, the FSR image sees a greater reduction to image stability in cases that are the most noticeable. So in the end, I think DLSS is moderately better. It's good to see very few ghosting issues, at least based on my experience with the game. At 1440p using the quality mode, FSR looks quite similar to the 4K performance mode. However, DLSS has somewhat reduced image stability compared to what we saw at 4K, so it falls back a bit and is now only slightly better than FSR. It's still better, but not by enough to make a huge fuss over, especially for this sort of title. It's the 1440p performance mode where terrible image quality strikes again for FSR 2.1 and to a lesser extent DLSS. Both upscalers are quite unstable with a blurry presentation, plenty of shimmering and general ugliness. But seriously, FSR looks super bad here, and any area where DLSS is slightly unstable, FSR will be very unstable, which, at least to me, is very distracting while gaming. If you need the performance on offer, DLSS performance is the significantly better choice, but realistically I just avoid these modes. Need for Speed Unbound is another fast-paced game, a bit of a different sort given that it's racing, but it's one of the few examples of FSR 2.2, which in this game sits alongside DLSS 2.4.12. Using the 4K quality mode, DLSS looks pretty decent in this game with great image stability and zero ghosting, at least in the areas that I tested. FSR was noticeably less stable, especially for problematic areas we've talked about previously like patterns, meshes, or grates shown at an oblique angle. As the game is super fast paced and often I was focusing on the car, which has very few if any reconstruction artifacts, I'd say DLSS has a small lead, but it's definitely ahead of FSR here. As we move to lower render resolutions like the 4K performance mode, the flickering and image instability seen previously is now much more obvious. The scaffolding at the start of this example has problems with both techniques, but the DLSS image is clearly superior and the more stable of the two. This is also true testing at 1440p using the quality mode with shimmering across any fine texture details such as the sides of buildings. I don't think anyone will want to play Need for Speed Unbound using the 1440p performance mode, but if you do, FSR 2.2 looks absolutely horrible here with major image stability issues. DLSS looks mediocre but is far better than the constant flickering and sizzling you get with FSR, so another very obvious example of FSR failing badly at super low render resolutions. Hogwarts Legacy is an interesting case. Using the 4K quality mode, at times I found it very difficult to discern any difference between DLSS 2.3.11 and FSR 2.1 in this title, especially in the more built up areas like Hogsmeade shown here and the interior of the Hogwarts castle. If you look closely, DLSS does a slightly better job of fine detail reconstruction, but at 4K it's hard to notice. But the big issue with upscaling in this game is the more outdoor forested areas, which cause problems for FSR. As we've seen in other examples, fine foliage detail tends to shimmer and flicker with FSR where it doesn't for DLSS, and the differences can be quite stark. It's the most noticeable artifact I saw across the entire game. Due to this one issue alone, I think DLSS is moderately better and is the preferred choice for Hogwarts Legacy. This continues to be true looking at other configurations like 4K performance. The image stability is definitely worse for both techniques compared to the quality setting, and generally I wouldn't recommend this mode. But as we get through our example here, as soon as we hit those more treed areas, FSR image quality falls away drastically relative to DLSS. It gets even worse at 1440p using the quality mode. DLSS is significantly better and more stable in these situations, making FSR pretty much unusable at 1440p if you hate this sort of artifact. And yes, I'll show the 1440p performance mode captures as well. This sort of configuration is just embarrassing for FSR. It looks absolutely terrible, and there's no way I could recommend someone play like this. Dying Light 2 is a surprisingly similar example to Hogwarts Legacy, even though in this game it's using the newer DLSS 2.4.0 version and the older FSR 2.0. At 4K, using the quality mode in areas without foliage, it can be difficult to distinguish between DLSS and FSR. Both seem to reconstruct well, there's negligible ghosting, and image stability is quite good. But in any areas with grass in particular, and there's a lot of them in Dying Light 2, FSR just can't handle this sort of element as well as DLSS. FSR in these situations looks blurry, while with DLSS, the various blades of grass still have a bit of clarity and definition. As we move to lower quality settings, this just gets worse and worse for FSR. DLSS also sees reduced foliage quality at lower render resolutions like with 4K performance, but FSR falls away more and ends up looking quite soupy while also introducing other stability problems. I think at 1440p using the quality mode that FSR holds up better in Dying Light 2 than in Hogwarts Legacy, so I'd only say DLSS is moderately better there, but again, when we hit the 1440p performance configuration, it's hard to say many positives for how FSR looks. The Spider-Man games, those being Remastered and Miles Morales, present an issue that we haven't discussed before, and that's sharpening. In a handful of titles, FSR sharpening is noticeably superior to DLSS sharpening, and that's the case with Spider-Man, which uses DLSS 2.4.12 and FSR 2.1. When trying to match the level of detail between DLSS and FSR, I just couldn't get a good result from DLSS. The image was either too soft, or in the case of these examples, over-sharpened with classic ringing artifacts. If you really hate this sort of artifact, then FSR is the way to go. But before you decide, there are plenty of issues with the FSR 2.1 presentation in these games, even at the 4K quality setting. Like we've seen in other games, fine texture details or geometry shown at oblique angles is a pain point for FSR, so when swinging around the city, the sides of buildings will often shimmer, giving DLSS a noticeable advantage as it doesn't suffer from this issue. This can even be problematic while standing still, so FSR has a long way to go before solving these sorts of instabilities. At lower render resolutions like 4K performance, we also see DLSS pull slightly ahead of FSR for rendering hair, which is a common trend among the games I've tested. At times, DLSS and FSR can have similar hair rendering, but at lower render resolutions, DLSS tends to look better. For example, here there is shimmering in both presentations, but more detail on the DLSS side. Similar is seen using the 1440p quality mode. With that said, when we reach the 1440p performance mode, hair quality is pretty horrible from either technique, so it's hard to say in that situation that DLSS looks better, but elsewhere in the game, such as general image stability, DLSS is clearly far superior. It wouldn't be a DLSS versus FSR video without looking at Cyberpunk 2077, which in its current iteration uses DLSS 2.3.4 and FSR 2.1. Many of these examples and artifacts we have seen before, so let's break it down using the 4K quality mode. On the DLSS side of things, the main issue in Cyberpunk continues to be ghosting for fast-moving objects, in particular cars and streetlights. In this example, there is clearly more ghosting on the DLSS side, even using the highest quality modes, whereas FSR has little to no ghosting. This is very similar to what we saw in Dead Space, even though Dead Space used a newer version of DLSS. Cyberpunk also has issues with DLSS sharpening, the quality of the filter is far worse than FSR, and the granularity of the slider is poor, such that you are often choosing between a soft image with no sharpening and an over-sharpened image with nothing in between. The FSR presentation isn't better though, and that comes down to image stability yet again. While FSR has better sharpening and no ghosting, elements across the screen are generally less stable, like wires, fences, lights, and other fine detailed elements. DLSS also does a superior job of fine detail reconstruction, so in a detailed world like this, DLSS looks a little bit better. But due to some of the other issues, I think DLSS only has a small lead here when looking at 4K quality. 4K performance looks poor in Cyberpunk whether we choose DLSS or FSR, however the DLSS image is generally more stable. There is still some ghosting present and flickering on both sides, but even for a given element, DLSS is less likely to flicker, and if it does, it typically flickers less. FSR can have an advantage with overhead wires at times, but really this is one of the few examples where FSR beats DLSS for stability. Like a lot of games, the 1440p results are better for DLSS than at 4K, with better image quality than FSR and superior stability. Like in Dead Space, ghosting was less of an issue at 1440p compared to 4K, while flickering is much more present in the FSR image to the point where it noticeably compromises image quality. The 1440p performance mode is absolutely horrible for FSR, it doesn't look like a 1440p game whatsoever, and while DLSS also looks pretty terrible, it's still miles ahead of FSR. So those are the 9 games I wanted to look at in depth, which cover the vast majority of the typical issues we see from DLSS and FSR upscaling. But let's take a look at all 26 games to see where my analysis ended up. First up, an explanation of our grading system. Each game configuration was graded on a 7-point scale. A tie is where either it was difficult to spot any noticeable differences between FSR and DLSS, or each technology had an equal amount of issues during gameplay. 1+ beside a technique means that the upscaling technology was slightly better, but not to the point where you'd want to pay extra to access it or would be missing out using the other technology. For example, if a game configuration is listed as DLSS+, that means DLSS is slightly better. 2+ means moderately better, a difference that's easily noticeable during gameplay to the point where it's worth having the feature and factoring that into your buying decision. 3+ means significantly better, where all aspects of image quality are superior and the other technology is often unusable in comparison. Of course, this is a subjective ranking system, so your opinion may vary based on your experience with these games or from viewing our comparison samples, and that's fine and even expected to some extent. But let's run through my opinion on these 26 games. The overwhelming conclusion from my analysis is that DLSS is the superior upscaling technology, with near universally better results using DLSS. Out of the 104 configurations I examined, there were only 8 times I thought DLSS and FSR were tied and 0 times where FSR was superior. This means that 92% of the time I thought DLSS was, at minimum, slightly better than FSR. I was also pretty surprised to see that FSR was not able to outperform DLSS under any circumstances. The absolute best case for AMD's technology is a tie. I was expecting maybe 1 or 2 titles to implement FSR better than DLSS, maybe an AMD sponsored title, or maybe something where DLSS's artifacts like ghosting were worse than FSR's artifacts in that configuration, but this really isn't the case, as any title where DLSS struggles, FSR is likely to struggle as well, even if those struggles aren't the same. The conditions under which DLSS beats FSR are different though, with FSR getting closer to DLSS at 4K and specifically using the quality mode. As we found in our previous examinations, FSR performs best at higher render resolutions, and while DLSS isn't amazing when the render resolution drops, the lower that render res, the better it performs relative to FSR. We go from DLSS getting a moderate or significant win in 9 titles using the 4K quality mode to 25 titles using the 1440p performance mode. When we break it down by resolution, DLSS and FSR are reasonably close at 4K using the quality mode. The 2 upscalers were tied on 5 occasions, and DLSS was only slightly better on a further 12 occasions. This means that around 2/3 of the time, FSR still performs well enough that I don't think it's worth fussing over, and DLSS isn't producing image quality so superior it justifies swapping to an Nvidia GPU. But even in this best case scenario, 1/3 of the time DLSS was noticeably better, so if the games you're most interested in fall in that category, it could play heavily on your buying decision. It's much harder to recommend gamers use the 4K performance mode due to relatively prevalent artifacts compared to the quality mode, but if you did want a more significant performance boost while maintaining a native resolution output, then DLSS has a clear advantage. In 19 of 26 games, I felt that DLSS was noticeably better in this configuration, leaving FSR with an acceptable result only 26% of the time. What is a really excellent result for Nvidia and a brutal result for AMD is what I found at 1440p, a super common resolution for gamers today. Using the highest quality mode, Quality saw a significant victory for DLSS in 18 games, with a further 8 games where DLSS was slightly better and 0 ties. When around 70% of the time you are better off to a noticeable degree using DLSS at 1440p, I think any gamer that plays at this resolution should definitely factor in upscaling to their buying decision. Nvidia GPUs are better at upscaling at this resolution, and that could be worth paying extra for depending on pricing and competing options. At 1440p using the performance mode, it's a complete demolition of FSR, which delivers embarrassing image quality in this configuration. In 19 games, I'd say FSR is practically unusable in this mode, while in a further 6 games, DLSS is still moderately better. Neither mode looks great here, and I wouldn't advocate for Nvidia GPU owners to suddenly start using the DLSS performance mode at 1440p. It still doesn't look great, but again, if you're after the biggest performance uplift at this resolution, Nvidia is totally dominant. So there we have it. DLSS is the superior upscaling solution as based on my analysis over 26 games. I don't think this would be a surprising result to many viewers, given it's something that we've repeated many times across our GPU benchmark videos. But what did surprise me is the degree to which DLSS is superior. The fact I couldn't find any examples of FSR delivering better image quality across 26 games, the best case being a tie, is a pretty brutal result for AMD's upscaler. And it's not like ties happened that often either, with DLSS being at least slightly superior in my opinion more than 90% of the time. For GPU buyers, I think upscaling is definitely something that you should be factoring into your buying decision these days. The use of the tech is widespread now, and in many cases it's worth enabling to get a performance boost at minimal impact to image quality. With DLSS being the better upscaler, this gives Nvidia a clear selling point to their GPUs, though the degree to which this matters does depend on resolution. While gaming at 4K, FSR gets pretty close around 2/3 of the time using the quality mode, but at 1440p, DLSS is clearly superior. What was interesting to discover is that the gap between DLSS and FSR hasn't shifted much over time. DLSS 2 is now on version 3.1.1 and FSR 2 is now on version 2.2, yet there was no real trend of, say, the FSR 2.2 games closing the gap on DLSS compared to the FSR 2.0 era. I do think FSR has improved, but so has DLSS, though both technologies could do with further optimizations. On the DLSS side, if Nvidia wanted to be totally dominant, there are 2 glaring issues that require fixes. Ghosting is still an issue with newer DLSS versions, and across the games I tested is more likely to exhibit ghosting. This is one of the few areas where FSR has superior reconstruction, and it's disappointing that over the several years we've had DLSS now, games like Dead Space are still launching with ghosting issues. DLSS also uses a clearly weaker sharpening filter. Nvidia has changed the way sharpening works in DLSS with more recent revisions, depreciating the older forced sharpening effect in favor of an optional solution, but still, in the vast majority of games, FSR sharpening pass looks better at a similar level of detail, with less ringing, more granular adjustment when sharpening sliders are present, and fewer artifacts. Nvidia would actually be better off using AMD's open source Fidelity FX contrast adaptive sharpening in DLSS, but of course this would never happen due to corporate politics. Failing that, maybe developers could replace Nvidia's sharpening with something better. And just on that, there's still some work to be done on the implementation front, given about 10 of the games I tested either had no sharpening slider option for one or both technologies, or didn't offer enough granular adjustment to sharpening. This can really be a personal preference thing, and the optimal level of sharpening can differ depending on the resolution and even the scene. It's crucial that a good sharpening slider is implemented in any game with upscaling or even just TAA. The list of things AMD needs to improve with FSR 2 is a lot longer. The key focus for their upscaling developers needs to be image stability. There are lots of examples where FSR displays shimmering in motion or even when standing still. Foliage needs to be a major priority. given the issues FSR has in foliage-heavy games can really ruin that experience. Fine textures, grates, meshes, and other patterns at oblique angles also often trips up FSR, hurting the experience in games with urban areas. There are heaps of examples where something as simple as windows on a skyscraper will flicker with FSR2. Hair and transparencies are other examples where FSR can struggle to produce a clean image, though these can be more game dependent than the other issues. I think this is hands down the most obvious issue with FSR across the games I looked at, and if AMD could tune FSR to produce a much more stable image, it would even up the contest against DLSS in a lot of games, and even deliver the better experience at times. The other big issue is the quality of upscaling from a lower render resolution. 4K quality mode is perfectly fine, 1440p performance mode is embarrassingly bad. And yeah, the performance mode isn't the most relevant mode given we typically don't recommend using it for either technology. There's lots of stability problems all around, but the problems we see there are also visible using the 1440p quality mode and FSR at 1080p. Fixing lower resolution rendering would lift up all of these use cases and make FSR much more viable at highly popular resolutions like 1440p. There are other edge cases to work on too, such as fine detail reconstruction, disocclusion sizzling, particle ghosting, but there's probably more pressing areas to improve. AMD also has the bigger task ahead of them when it comes to game support for FSR2. While this has been improving rapidly, there are still major titles that have been released without FSR or have only included support months after release. Modern Warfare 2, for example, only just patched in FSR2, having launched last year with just FSR 1 alongside DLSS and Intel's XeSS. AMD should be all over that sort of situation. Similarly, there are games released without DLSS support, like Resident Evil 4 that only supports FSR2. Having a game sponsored by AMD or Nvidia shouldn't exclude the other vendors' technologies. That's just poor form and ends up hurting the buyers of that game more than anything. So yeah, that's where things stand between FSR2 and DLSS2 at the moment across a wide variety of games. In this video, I tried to include as many of the DLSS and FSR games that I could find. There weren't too many more examples that I probably could have included here. But yeah, I think once you start looking at across the actual 26 game sample, you start seeing very similar trends of the issues across all the different titles. So yeah, I think this is a pretty thorough summary of the areas where FSR needs to improve and also some of the benefits of DLSS and also I guess where DLSS could improve as well. So yeah, this is a mammoth video. These sorts of videos take a long time to put together. So if you do appreciate this sort of testing and content, then please do consider supporting us via our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description below. We really appreciate everyone that signs up and gains access to things like our Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS videos, and all that sort of thing. We will be back soon to also throw in native rendering into the mix to see whether the common claim that DLSS renders better than native. We'll see whether that's true in an upcoming video. But until then, yeah, that's probably going to do it for DLSS versus FSR for some time. If there's any major updates in terms of new revisions or things like that, then we might consider covering it. But for now, we're just going to leave it here. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.